Hello, my name is William Henry. I'm a historian and archaeologist and a writer here in Galway City, and you're very welcome to my virtual tour of the city. The tour is actually based on my book, Galway Walking Through History. And while Galway was founded by the Normans in the 13th century, the history of habitation here goes back a lot further. In fact, it goes back to the Stone Age, to the Neolithic period. And over the next hour or so, I'm going to take you on a virtual tour of Galway. I'm going to introduce you to Galway, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, the early Christian period, what was here long before the Normans ever got here in the 13th century. And this is a very important aspect to Galway. And then we will take the tour from your square. Where we're standing now is in the virtual heart of the city. So we'll be starting our tour here of the various historical sites that have survived all these centuries. But first, we're going to look at the background to Galway, how it evolved, where it came from, and the city they built on the River Corrib. Now the river in the background is the River Corrib. It's a short river, about 2 miles long, but it's fed by vast waters of the lakes of Lough Corrib. There's 2 upper lakes, and for centuries they were known as Lough Corrib, but prior to that they were known as Lough Orbson. And Orbson was reputed to have been a notable figure, a legendary figure with the ancient two-headed Onan, one of the magical peoples that actually invaded Ireland and ruled Ireland for a number of centuries. Now, the river is very important because this is on which Galway was built. And to explain the city, the name of the name we have today for Galway, for centuries historians have disputed how did Galway actually achieve its name. How did it evolve as Galway? Now there are a number of different versions, but the 3 main ones are that when the Normans came here in the 13th century, the native Irish at the time, speaking the old Gaelic language, they would call these people the Gal, the foreigner, in other words. The Gal, the old word for the foreigner, the old Irish word for the foreigner. And they then would call it the town of the foreigner, hence the name Gal Town Way. So that was one version of it. There was another version that on this river, the lady by the name of Galway was drowned. Now she was a fair Bulgar princess that lived 3,000 years ago. Her father's name was Barnacle, and out beyond the Atlantic, beyond the Iron Islands, there's a magical island that's supposed to appear and disappear every 7 years. And some say it's Chirnanog, others refer to it as High Brazil, named after this Brazil. But this Brazil's daughter, Galway, became a very important figure for Galway. We could say that she's our first Galway girl. And she was drowned here in these rivers, these waters, over 3,000 years ago. And the river became known as Galway's River for the time. And hence the name Galway, Galway. So we really do need to recognise Galway as being, we say, one of the few towns that has a source of a lady's name that it's named after. It's a very important piece of our folklore history. Again, she was one of the fair Bulgar princesses, that's what she was. Now, there is another version of it, and it's very simple. It's the old word for Galliv, is the place of the Stony River. And if the mouth of the river on a low tide, you can actually see it is a very stony river. So those are the 3 interpretations of how Galway got its name. Again, it's disputed for centuries by historians, and I'm sure it'll go on for the next few centuries being disputed, and we will probably never know for sure how it got its name. Human habitation in the Galway area dates from at least the Irish Mesolithic period, which was about 8000 BC. Mesolithic simply means Middle Stone Age, and the people who lived during this period are often referred to as hunter-gatherers. They lived mainly along the rivers and coastal regions, as the interior of the country was densely wooded during this time. They collected edible berries, hunted small animals, and fished along the coast and in the rivers. Evidence for these people has been found on the bed of the River Corrib around the Menlo area. These include stone scrapers and other small stone implements. The Mesolithic was followed by the Neolithic period, or New Stone Age. This was when people first began to settle in the Galway area. This period dates from about 4000 BC, and soon the first farms began to emerge as the forests were being cleared. Again, the River Corrib has produced evidence for these people in the form of stone arrowheads and axe heads. Axe heads have also been discovered on the land around Minlow. Minlow is an old village now within city limits. Artefacts have also been found in other areas of Galway. In addition to these finds, there is the remains of a portal tomb dating from this period located near Minlow village. The discovery of this tomb was of great significance, as it is the first indication of a community actually living in the Galway area. The vast waters of Lough Corrib have yielded additional proof of early habitation with the discovery of logboats. These were brought to public attention after divers from the National Monument Service revealed that a series of sunken dugout canoes were found at the bottom of the lake. The waters of the Corrib is of vital importance to the city in many ways, but, as mentioned already, from a historical perspective, the river is a virtual time tunnel to our past. One of the great advancements for mankind was the discovery and development of metals, which occurred towards the end of the Neolithic period. These early metalsmiths discovered that by melting tin and copper ore together, they could produce a much harder metal that we now call bronze. This metal gave its name to the Bronze Age, which in Ireland dates from circa 2000 to 4000 BC. The people of this period left a number of monuments and artefacts as proof of their existence. The artefacts include bronze spearheads and swords, which were also found in the River Corrib. The monuments left behind by these people include Fulloch the Fia, which are often referred to in English as cooking places. There were at least 7 on the east side of the city alone, but all of them were lost during road development. There is another located near Renmore in the city, and many more can be found throughout County Galway. It has been suggested that these sites continued in use during the Iron Age, and perhaps even over a longer period of time. There is a large standing stone located in the Roscam area of the city. Some believe that this stone marks a Bronze Age grave. However, according to tradition, it was erected by St. Hugh of Roscam over the grave of King Brian of Connacht. King Brian was recorded as the ancestor of a number of Connacht kings and the celebrated Irish families of OConnor, O'Flaherty and O'Rourke. According to tradition, King Brian was also the elder brother of the famous Irish High King Niall of the Nine Hostages. The stone is hugely important from a Bronze Age perspective, but it also leads one directly into the Iron Age in Galway. The Iron Age in Ireland dates from between 400 BC and 400 AD. The people who occupied Ireland during this period are mainly referred to as the Celts. They used elaborate decoration on their swords, helmets, and other possessions. The Celts were a powerful force in Europe, and over time their influence gradually spread throughout the ancient world. It has been said that after the Celts were defeated by the Romans, Ireland became one of their last places of refuge. The Celts certainly left the country richer in decorative art, language and traditions. One of the finest examples of their decorative work can be found on the famous Turo stone, which was located near the village of Bullone in County Galway. This large granite stone is finely decorated with the Celtic Latine style and acts as a reminder of the wonderful crafts created in those early times. As with the earlier periods, a relic of these people was found in the bed of the River Corrib. This was in the form of a Latine decorated sword. The Celts also left Ireland a wealth of legends, stories that are still being told and written about today. One of the most common features of the ancient landscape found across Ireland were the ringforts. Many of these structures emerged towards the end of the Iron Age and continued in use over the following centuries. They were not forts in the military sense, but rather the protected homesteads of the ancient Irish farmers. They were normally circular in shape and were protected by a large earthen bank, on top of which a palisade of timber would have been erected. A fosse was dug around the outside, making the fort more imposing. While many of these sites have been lost through land development, some fine examples have survived throughout the country. For instance, the Ballyban Ringfort in Galway is a really fine example of this type of structure, and it was protected on the outside by 2 earthen banks and 2 palisades of timber during its period of use. The Ballyban Fort also contains a souterrain, which was a feature of some large and more important ringforts. Souterrains are man-made underground tunnels and chambers. They are lined on both sides with dry stone walls and roofed with flat stone lintels. Once the stonework was completed, it was then covered with earth, thus making them almost impossible to detect. They were multi-purpose structures used for storing food and sometimes acted as a protection during severe weather conditions or as a defence against attack. Although they have their origins in the Iron Age, they are mainly associated with the early Christian period. Now, this is the Ballyban Ringfort, one of the most ancient monuments within the Galway city limits today. It's roughly about 1500 years old, dating from the early Christian period, but most of these sites are termed Iron Age sites because they have their origins there. Now, this is a very important site. It was a double ramparted ringfort, and we believe that it was part of, we'll say, an earlier culture belonging to the hierarchy of the people that would have lived here at the time. It's also got a souterrain, which makes it very important as well. And the souterrain is an underground tunnel that we'll speak about a little later. And the entrance to it was here at this particular tree, and it still does underground here to this tree and runs off into a chamber on that side, but it had to be closed for safety reasons. Around here to this particular section of the Ringfort is the remaining of one of the fosses. So we'll have a look at that now also in a moment. Medieval times, and this one here is a prime example. They used to grind pigment in them. The monks would have in this area. Now, in later years, I mean the 18th, 19th and 20th centuries, the early part of the 20th century, people came here when these filled with water, and they believed that there was a cure in them for warts and for ear and eye ailments. So they became kind of penitential stations in a sense. Now, we're now in the Roscam monastic settlement, founded by St. Odrin in the 6th century. Behind me you can see the round tower, and Also a medieval church, the remains of a medieval church. Over here we have a medieval cemetery. Major renovations were carried out in Eyre Square during the early 1960s, which included the removal of the railings. This left the brown doorway, which was the main entrance to the square, standing like a lone sentinel without a purpose. The brown doorway is one of the foremost features of Eyre Square, and indeed Galway, and has been since it was erected there in 1905. The doorway was originally the entrance to the home of Martin Brown and his wife Maria Lynch, and dates from 1627. They were members of two very powerful and influential Galway tribal families. Their coats of arms form part of the carvings over the doorway. The house was located in Lower Abbeygate Street, but had fallen into a ruined state by the 19th century. There were concerns about the doorway, but in 1905 the Galway Archaeological and Historical Society came to the rescue of the doorway and window and had them removed and re-erected at Eyre Square. The statue of Pádraig OConnor is located almost centrally in the park. He was one of Ireland's greatest Gaelic writers. O'Connor was born in Galway City in 1882. His parents died when he was young, leaving him in the care of his grandparents in Connemara. He later attended Rockwell and Blackrock colleges, and as a young man joined the civil service in London. While in London, he taught Irish for the Gaelic League and also began his writing career. By 1914, his need for freedom and self-expression overwhelmed him, and he resigned from the civil service. O'Connor returned to Connemara, and in the familiar surroundings he loved so dearly, began writing more vigorously. During his nomadic lifestyle, O'Connor managed to write some 25 books. In addition, he produced over 100 short stories and many more articles. Dubliner Mary, Molly as she was known, McManus, became his common-law wife, with whom he had 3 girls and a boy. He eventually married her in 1926. O'Connor died in October 1928 in Richmond Hospital, Dublin. Following his funeral, he was laid to rest in the new cemetery at Bohermore in Galway. In 1934, Eamon de Valera unveiled a statue to Pádraig O'Connor at Eyre Square. The statue was sculptured by Albert Power. It was always a huge attraction, and thousands of people had their photographs taken at the statue of this great old Irish writer. Unfortunately, the statue was vandalised some years ago and has now found a safe home in Galway City Museum. The statue was replaced by this current one in 2016. There is a memorial to the United States President John F. Kennedy located in the eastern side of Eyre Square. This was the work of local artist Albert O'Toole. The memorial was commissioned locally to commemorate the visit of President Kennedy on the 29th of June 1963. The President was presented with the Freedom of Galway at Eyre Square by Councillor Paddy Ryan, Mayor of Galway. It was a hugely exciting day for the city, with thousands of people turning out to welcome the American President. Following the assassination of President Kennedy in November 1963, the local authorities in Galway decided to carry out renovations on Eyre Square. The railings were removed and the area was redeveloped into a modern-style park. It was officially reopened by Cardinal Richard Cushing of Boston in August 1963, and renamed the John F. Kennedy Memorial Park. However, this name is rarely used, and the area is still known as Eyre Square. The fountain located near the brown doorway no longer functions as a fountain, and one could be forgiven for thinking that it's an unusual type sculpture. It was officially inaugurated on the 15th of December 1984 to conclude the quincentenary celebrations, which Galway were commemorating its 500 years as a mayoral city. This was one of the many events that took place during that year. The 20-foot statue is the work of Eamon O'Doherty. The fountain was commissioned by Galway Corporation and financed by the Bank of Ireland. The design of the fountain symbolises the maritime history of Galway. The sculpture represents the sails of the famous Galway hooker, a traditional sailing craft off the west of Ireland. These boats were vital for fishing and transport during the 19th century, and indeed much earlier. There was a major decline in the use of these boats throughout the 20th century because of modern vessels and fishing methods. However, there has been a strong revival of the Galway hooker in recent years, and today they have become a very popular pleasure craft rather than a working boat. Now we're at the old medieval walls of Galway, started in 1270 and eventually surrounded the entire city. What we have today is some of the reconstructed and original structure, including towers, that's behind me here. A section of the old city walls of Galway and two of its towers may be seen in the Eyre Square shopping centre. The restored structure is a wonderful example of how ancient and modern Galway can complement each other. The story of the walls of Galway dates from the 13th century. In May 1250, Walter de Burgo took command of the Normans in Galway. He married the daughter of Hugh de Lacy, the Earl of Ulster, and he then assumed this title and acquired vast territories in Ulster, making him the most powerful Norman in Ireland. The construction of the town walls of Galway began under his lordship in 1270. That same year, the Irish, under Aid O'Connor, inflicted a terrible defeat on the Normans. And they say it was following this defeat that de Burgo decided to surround the fledgling town with strong stone walls. However, the battle had proved too much for him, and he died a year later in his castle at Galway. He was succeeded by his son Richard, who became known as the Red Earl. The town was described at the time as a beleaguered post. Such was the persistent threat from the native Irish. Thus, the walls of Galway were vital as a protection against the continued hostility of the natives. Along the walls, additional fortifications and towers were erected. Another feature was a strong stone batter constructed along the lower section of the wall. This was both a defensive feature and an element of structural support. Inside these protected defences, the town continued to grow and eventually boasted of 14 streets, 14 lanes, and of course the same number of tribes eventually emerged. It was said to be modelled on Rome, but doubled in the number of features over the Eternal City. Finance for the construction of the walls and the fortifications was raised by placing taxes on wine, wool, cloth, leather, salt, fish, and other commodities. This would indicate the customs or taxes received in Galway was considerable at that time. The walls were mainly manned by a type of defence force which was made up of military-trained young men. It is worth remembering that despite two major sieges during the 17th century, the walls of Galway were never actually breached. By the end of the 18th century, the walls of the old city were falling into a ruined state, and most of the structure was lost during this period. This section of wall and both towers you can see today were hidden by 19th century developments in the area. However, following a major fire in 1971, the medieval remains were again exposed. Plans were put in place in the 1980s for a shopping centre in this area. The historical significance of the structure was taken into account, and thus archaeological excavations and restoration work began. The result of this restoration and preservation of these wonderful late medieval features can be seen today. While the wall is original, it has been strengthened and repointed. It was originally higher and the ground level lower, which must have made it a very imposing structure in those early times. The lower section of both the Penrice and Shoemaker Towers are original, but the upper sections are completely reconstructed. One can see this clearly from the differences in the masonry. The batter running along the base of the wall is entirely reconstructed. However, this feature, original section, still exists beneath the ground surface. There is also the foundation of a diamond-shaped bastion dating from 1647, spreading out on the part of the shopping centre from the Shoemaker Tower section. Behind me is Lynchs Castle, one of the finest medieval tower houses surviving in Ireland today. Dating from the late 15th century, Lynchs Castle in Shop Street, Galway, is a wonderful example of a late medieval home. It has been described as the finest urban tower house surviving in Ireland. While it is referred to as a castle, it is in fact a tower house. This was the home of the Lynch family until they lost their property after the Cromwellians forced them from public office in the mid-17th century. It has been suggested that this was the home of Thomas Lynch Fitzambrose, who is also associated with the King's Head pub. It is important to remember that this is not the only tower house that was in Galway at one time. However, it is possibly one of the most ornate and provides people with a glimpse of how the city would have looked during that period. The Lynch family were one of the most powerful of the tribes of Galway. They were of Norman origin and dominated city life and corporation for many years. In fact, they were mainly responsible for the ancient town gaining city status between 1484 and 1485. Their power can be judged by the fact that they produced over 80 mayors of Galway during those early years. It has been said that the character of the stonework on the building was the very latest in Gothic of that period. While it is typically Irish in design, it resembles contemporary merchant homes in the port of Bristol in England. The castle is 4 stories in height, and the ground floor was used for storage rather than being utilised as a living quarters. The first floor would have housed the parlour and living room. The second and third floors were sleeping quarters. It seems there was also a great hall located at the rear, complete with a finely carved timber roof, at the end of which was a kitchen. One can visualise from the superb carvings on the castle the sheer wealth of this family. The hood mouldings over the windows are intricately carved and contain some very interesting designs. The gargoyles at roof level protrude almost as guardians watching over this important building. The coat of arms of King Henry VII is framed inside a large rectangular panel facing Shop Street. This was of huge significance and an indication of the family loyalty to the crown. Henry VII had taken the throne of England in 1485 after the War of the Roses. The Lynch coat of arms can also be seen on the Shop Street facade, framed inside a round panel. On the Abbey Street side of the castle, the arms of the Earl of Kildare are proudly displayed inside another round panel and are believed to date from 1504. This was the year that the Earl liberated the city following the Battle of Knockdoe. While the exact date of the castle is not known for certain, the royal coat of arms may provide a clue as to when the Tower House was actually built. Henry VII became king in 1485, and the Earl of Kildare arrived in Galway in 1504. This could indicate that the castle was constructed sometime between these two dates, or shortly afterwards. Just below the arms of Henry VII, there is a rather strange carving, which some people say is a representation of an ape holding a baby. This carving gave credence to the story of a pet ape having saved a baby after a fire broke out in the castle. However, this story is taken directly from the realm of myth. Looking more closely at the carving, one can see that it resembles a lion and not an ape. Other interesting features in the castle include gun loops, as well as a slit window on the corner of the building. There were substantial renovations carried out on the castle during the early 19th century. There is a stone fireplace located in the foyer of the building, and it is dated 1629. This, however, was taken from another building during the 1930s, and it found a new home in the castle. By the end of the 19th century, the castle served as a chandler's shop. In 1918, the building was acquired by the Munster and Leinster Bank, now the Allied Irish Bank. Restoration work was carried out in 1930, and the finely carved main doorway by Lawrence Campbell was added in 1933. Galway is extremely fortunate to have such an elaborate building as part of its modern fabric, and one can only marvel at the builders all those centuries ago. It is also a testament to the wealth and prominence of a people who took pride in their city of culture. This is the facade of the old Cathedral of Galway, which was foundation stone was laid in 1816. It is a hugely important building from a Galway standpoint, and also it has connotations going back to the tribal families. On over the windowsills and the doorways have the remains of the tribal family crests. The Cathedral was located on the corner of Abbey Street Lower and Middle Street. The building is now home to a number of shops and businesses. It is a very important structure in the religious history of Galway. The foundation stone for the church was laid on the 1st of July 1816, by Hyacinth Daly, the Protestant Mayor of Galway. One must remember that at this time it was prior to Catholic emancipation being granted, which makes the church highly significant. One contemporary described the scene as being unparalleled in the history of Galway, or in the history of the British Empire. Protestants and Catholics, both civil and ecclesiastical, dressed in their official robes of office, were preceded by their various insignias and marched in solemn procession to the main streets of the city to perform the ceremony. Some 10,000 people turned out to witness this historic event. It seems that the construction was partly funded by some of the remaining tribal families. The crests of these families were erected over the windows of the church. These include the French, Blake, Lynch, Brown, and Martin family crests. Although dating from the 19th century, the carvings are a reminder of a medieval Galway. It was appropriate that the descendants of these tribal families were involved in the project. The church was completed in 1821 with additional financial support organised by Father Peter Daly. It was officially named the Catholic Church of St. Nicholas. However, following the establishment of the Galway diocese in 1831, it became known as the Cathedral. However, to generations of Galway people, it is simply called the parish church. A terrible tragedy occurred there on Christmas morning 1842, when people gathered in the Cathedral for 6 a.m. Mass. As Father Bartholomew Roach, parish priest, was about to begin celebrating the Mass, someone in the gallery shouted that the floor was collapsing. The warning was given because a noise was heard that sounded like timber splintering. The alarm caused instant panic throughout the congregation, and there was a frantic rush to the exits. Many of those trapped in the gallery were so terrified that they opened the windows and jumped, some to their deaths in the streets below. Most of the congregation tried to force their way out through the main exit, resulting in the front porch being completely crammed with people, making escape almost impossible. It was described as a most pitiful scene. The terror and screams of people being crushed in the confined space was appalling. Many of them were panic-stricken parents with children trying frantically to reach the safety of the street only a few feet away. After the church was eventually cleared, there was a gloomy silence in the street as people began to realise that the frightful panic was groundless. It was a false alarm, as there was no danger of the gallery collapsing. The person responsible was never identified, but it was mentioned that he or she truly believed that the gallery was about to collapse. It was a heart-rending scene, as 37 people had been killed, many of them children. Many more were injured. The flickering gaslight added to the gloomy atmosphere that hung over that awful scene. During the inquest that followed, the verdict was unanimous, and it was clear that the disaster was not malicious, but rather a tragic accident. There were more pitiful scenes over the following days as the funerals of the victims left the same church. In one day alone, 17 bodies were buried in Fort Hill Cemetery. In time, the tragedy faded into memory and the church went back to normal. During the War of Independence, between 1919 and 1921, the church was crowded on a number of occasions during the funeral masses of Irish Republicans shot dead by the Black and Tans. The church was also famous for its parish missions and its confirmation days. The old parish church was the centre of religious life in the city throughout its history. In 1937, Dr. Michael Brown became Bishop of Galway. The ceremony was conducted in the parish church. During his address, he said that the building was no longer adequate to accommodate the growing congregation. A more appropriate building was required, and so he endorsed plans for the new building of a new cathedral. The old pro-cathedral finally closed its doors in 1965 when the new cathedral opened. There was a suggestion that the pro-cathedral should be redeveloped into a city museum, but this never materialised, and today it's a small shopping mall. One cannot talk about Galway City without mentioning the legendary hanging of Walter Lynch. According to tradition, the Mayor of Galway, James Lynch Fitzstephen, hanged his own son from the window of their home after he was found guilty of murdering a young Spaniard named Felipe Gomez. The terrible deed is supposed to have taken place in 1493, after the mayor returned from Spain. He had been on a trading mission and was accompanied by Gomez, who was to be his guest in Galway. The mayor's son Walter was in a relationship with a young woman named Agnes. Gomez befriended Agnes, and this resulted in young Lynch becoming jealous. He suspected that Gomez and Agnes had feelings for each other, and this played heavily on his mind. One night, he watched as Gomez left the home of Agnes. Lynch was furious. He followed Gomez and, in a fit of jealous rage, stabbed him to death. He left the murder scene, but surrendered the following day. His father, being mayor and was also chief magistrate, had to preside over the case against his own son. Young Lynch was found guilty and sentenced to death. The mayor allowed him to spend the night before his execution at home. The following morning, a large crowd gathered outside the house to prevent the young man being taken to his place of execution. The mayor, being a God-fearing man who believed in justice for all, felt obliged to carry out the dreadful act himself and hanged his son from the upper window of the mansion. Another account mentions that Walter Lynch was appointed captain of one of his father's ships going to Spain. He was entrusted with a sum of money to purchase a cargo of wine. However, he squandered the money and used his father's good name as credit to secure the merchandise. The Spanish merchant who supplied the wine had his nephew accompany Lynch on the return journey. This was to collect the payment. During the voyage, Lynch became extremely worried about his father being made aware of the embezzlement. He decided that his only course of action was to murder the Spaniard. Most of the crew were bribed into supporting Lynch, while others did so out of fear. That night, the unfortunate Spaniard was violently seized from his bed and thrown overboard. Upon returning home, Lynch was welcomed by his father, who shortly afterwards set him up in business. All went well for a time, and Lynch, being confident that his crime would not be discovered, made plans to marry. However, shortly before the wedding, one of the sailors who had been on that fateful voyage became extremely ill. As the man drew close to death, he sent for the mayor and told him of the murder committed by his son. The father then ensured that justice was upheld and executed his own son. The question for most people is, did the hanging take place? James Lynch Fitzstephen was indeed the Mayor of Galway in 1493. Although it is simply a legend, James Hardiman published these accounts in his 1820 History of Galway. It seems that he had modified the story from an 1807 historical novel called George III by Reverend Edward Margin. Other documents indicated that a dreadful incident had occurred in Galway. In 1674, a Dominican priest named Father de Jura arrived from Spain. The purpose of his visit was to trace the pedigree of a Lynch cleric who was being appointed a senior at the academic post in Seville. The priest recorded that he was shown a folio containing information about the mayor, saying that this James had his own son hanged. However, there is no real evidence to support the story, and therefore it must be viewed with great suspicion, as the incident would surely have been recorded in the ancient corporation records. The house where the supposed hanging took place stood in Market Street until it was demolished during the 19th century. The story attracted visitors to Galway, and it was only a matter of time before someone decided to give the tourists exactly what they expected. In 1854, Father Peter Daly, chairman of the town commissioners, had the Lynch Memorial window erected in Market Street. The monument is really a concoction of various archaeological fragments, all assembled together along with an information plaque. Its purpose was to highlight the tradition of the mayor hanging his own son. The plaque states it was on this spot the hanging took place. Over time, the people began to believe the story that Walter Lynch was actually hanged from this window, which cannot have been the case because it's a 17th century window. Another myth that evolved from the alleged hanging resulted in some people believing the term Lynch law had its origins in the story. However, this term belongs to either Colonel Charles Lynch or Captain William Lynch, both from Virginia in the United States, who carried out their own form of justice during the late 19th century. We are now taking a slight detour from the regular tour to go down a place called Bowling Green. It's just off Market Street. It's after the Lynch Memorial window stop, and it's to just show you one house down here, the Nora Barnacle home. Nora Barnacle was the wife of the celebrated literary giant James Joyce. Her home was located in 8 Bowling Green, in a very old part of the city. The present houses date from the 19th century, including the Barnacle home. Nora was born in March 1884. She was the second child in a family of 8. Her parents were Thomas and Annie Barnacle. Thomas worked as a baker and Annie earned a living as a dressmaker. Young Nora lived for a number of years with her grandmother, Catherine Healy, in St. Augustine Street. She was a high-spirited, good-looking girl with auburn hair. She was very popular and had many friends. As a teenager, Nora fell in love with Michael Bodkin. He was a student in University College Galway. The Bodkin family had a shop in Prospect Hill, and Nora often frequented the premises. While Michael was busy serving customers, Nora treated herself to some of her favourite sweets. Now, Bodkin was well aware of her little routine, but ignored this little transgression as he was falling in love with her. It was a time when young lovers had to be careful not to draw any unwelcome attention to themselves. Nevertheless, they managed to meet regularly, and a loving relationship developed. Tragically, just as their love blossomed into maturity, young Bodkin developed tuberculosis. He died on the 11th of February 1900 and was interred in her tomb in Rohan Cemetery. Nora was devastated and withdrew from life, but over time she emerged from her grief. She met another young man and they began dating, but her family objected because he was a Protestant. In fact, Nora received a thrashing from her uncle because of the relationship. A short time later she left Galway and travelled to Dublin. She found employment in Finn's Hotel in Lynchs Street. Nora began exploring her surroundings, and on the 10th of June 1904, while walking down Nassau Street, she met a young man that attracted her attention. He began a conversation with her. She was a little surprised by his manner in which he dressed, wearing a sailor's cap and canvas shoes. However, he reminded her somewhat of Michael Botkin, and she felt comfortable in his company. They arranged to meet on the 14th of June, but Nora didn't turn up for this date. Joyce sent a note requesting her to meet him on the 16th of June, now celebrated as Bloomsday. She met him on this occasion and they went for a walk. It was a day that changed both their lives forever. Joyce developed a deep love for Nora and liked to hear her sing The Lass of Aughrim, a song she learned in Bowling Green from her mother. She told Joyce of the relationship with Botkin. This story of young love moved Joyce to such a degree that he immortalised them both in his book The Dead, published in 1907. Joyce often referred to Michael Botkin and did so in his notes to exiles. Joyce and Nora had two children, Giorgio and Lucia, and in 1912 the family arrived in Galway for a visit. They attended the Galway races, went boating on the River Corrib and visited the Aran Islands. They also went to Michael Botkin's tomb in Rohan Cemetery, after which Joyce wrote a poem entitled She Weeps Over Rohan. It seems he was trying to capture Nora's mood as she stood over the grave of her former lover. Joyce and Nora were married on the 4th of July 1931. They moved to Paris, where they lived for a number of years. In December 1940, the family moved to Zurich. By this time, Joyce was very ill, and he died a short time later on the 13th of January 1941. He was laid to rest in a beautiful wooded cemetery above Zurichburg. Nora remained in Zurich, but lived in relative poverty. In fact, she had to sell most of his manuscripts and her jewellery to survive. Nora Barnacle died on the 10th of April 1951 and was buried some distance from her husband. However, their bodies were later exhumed and reburied together in a grave donated by the city of Zurich. On Bloomsday 1966, a bronze memorial was unveiled over the grave. In 1987, The Dead was celebrated in film. It was directed by John Huston and starred his daughter Angelica. His son Anthony wrote the screenplay. The former home of Michael Botkin is now incorporated in Richardson's Pub, Eyre Square, and a plaque commemorating their love story was erected there on 6th of June 1996. This is the Church of St. Nicholas, the Collegiate Church of St. Nicholas. It was founded in 1320 and we believe co-joined to an earlier church. It is a jewel in the crown in Galway of archaeology and history. Now you're welcome to the Church of St. Nicholas, the Collegiate Church of St. Nicholas. You are now in the interior of it. One is spoiled for Joyce here with the amount of memorials, architectural features and that you can be found throughout the church. We're going to take a brief walk around and highlight some of the memorials in the church. So the first one here we have is this beautifully, intricately carved baptismal font dated from the late 16th and early 17th century. As you can see, some memorials on the wall in the background. Now this is the Great War Monument of 1914-18. It's dedicated to some of the men from the parish that fell in the Great War. It's based on the Book of Kells. It's a wonderfully carved monument. We know that over 1,200 men from Galway actually died in the Great War. Now here we have a lovely example of an early tomb, believed to be the so-called Crusader's tomb it's called, dedicated to a man, some say Alfred Buren was his name. Now, there is a school of thought that this particular tomb was part of the earlier church that was on the site. And this is another beautiful stained glass window, also by the Pearse family, donated again in the late 19th century. And here, as we pass the Chapel of the Blessed Sacrament, on the floor, we have beautifully carved memorial stones to the tradesmen who died and were buried here. And this leads us to this beautifully, intricately carved water stoup. The date we're not certain of, but we think was around the 15th century. And the stonework in it resembles stonework that was in the early Abbey of St. Francis, not too far from here. Now this is a wall tomb belonging to the Lynch family behind us there, with the, of course, sheltered by the window. Now the angels that you see were defaced by the Cromwellians when they came in here in 1652. They destroyed an awful lot of the church. The iconography of the church, should I say, and according to tradition, stable their horses here. Now this is another floor tomb, very badly damaged that you can see. And again, according to tradition, when Cromwell stabled these horses here, they were tied here, and it was the horses' hooves that destroyed the stone. But as you can see, they missed this little angel up here. And again, more memorials on each side. Again, Connacht Rangers. And here we have two memorials to the Eyre family, who was Mayor of Galway, Edward Eyre, during the early 18th century, and this one was dedicated to his wife. Now here we have what's known as the apprentice column. It differs from the other columns. So there's a round. This one is different. It's a different piece entirely. And according to the history of the church, the apprentices that actually put this together. seemingly in that time the apprentices would have to produce something for their master, who was their contractor, what we would call today a contractor. And when they produced this was the master's piece, and the word masterpiece actually comes from that. And again here, all along here, you have wonderful carved memorial stones. In 1484, the church authorities in Galway petitioned Pope Innocent VIII for religious independence, as they were under the jurisdiction of Tuam at the time. The request was granted, and this led to the appointment of a warden and 8 vicars to govern the church. Over the following centuries, the church continued to evolve and was embellished by the various merchant families of Galway. On the 29th of April 1551, the church was given collegiate status by the Crown, and it was also given the title the Royal College of Galway. While it was built as a Catholic church, it changed hands on a number of occasions because of religious conflicts. A decline in religious tolerance during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I led to public mass being forbidden. This was in 1568. It came under the control of the Catholic population for a short time, but suffered dreadfully at the hands of the Cromwellians in 1652. A walk around the interior of this church will take one back through time to the very foundation of the city. It is a wonderful experience, particularly for those with an imaginative mind, as the past is there just waiting to be explored throughout this ancient building. Behind me is the King's Head, a landmark pub in Galway with a strong association with the execution of King Charles I in 1649. And we're going to go inside and have a look at some of the medieval fabric that has survived in the pub. On the 12th of April 1652, Colonel Peter Stubbers led the Cromwellian army triumphantly into Galway city. Stubbers was a volatile man, and in 1654 he became the first Protestant mayor of the new order in Galway. He had all priests rounded up and imprisoned, and was responsible for hundreds of young people being sold into slavery. He was also responsible for the destruction of many fine houses and the desecration of tombs in search of treasure. There is a strong possibility that he was the executioner of Charles I, who was beheaded on the 30th of January 1649. In fact, it was rumoured among the Cromwellians themselves that he carried out the deadly deed. There were 2 masked men on the execution platform that day, and both insisted that their identities be protected. Stubbers was also one of the signatories to the King's death warrant. Now, there are a number of stories about the naming of the King's Head pub. Some say that Stubbers was given the pub as payment for carrying out the execution. Others say that he opened the pub from finance received after beheading the king. It was also believed for many years that another Cromwellian, Richard Gunning, who lived at the rear of the King's Head property, was the man who carried out the execution. According to this tradition, Gunning had often boasted that he felt the muscles on the neck of the King of England. However, some people say this was simply an idle boast and the real culprit was Peter Stubbers. However, Stubbers, being a smart man, allowed Gunning to take the responsibility in order to avoid any unwelcome attention that might arise later. During research carried out some years ago, which included interviews with the descendants of Peter Stubbers, the family said that, according to family tradition, they indicated that he was actually the executioner of Charles I. And they described Richard Gunning as simply a publican and didn't believe he had anything to do with the execution. It was rumoured that the Gunning family had plantations in Barbados and Montserrat, and that they were involved in the slave trade. Perhaps they found a ready supplier in Peter Stubbers, who is also known to have used his position to support this barbaric practice. Another important factor in the identification of the executioner is the existence of a contemporary painting of the execution, now on display in the National Gallery of Scotland. In the right-hand corner of the painting, there is a portrait of a man holding an axe in one hand and the severed head of Charles II in the other. It is not known for certain whom this figure represents, but three people have been suggested. Stubbers, as we mentioned already. According to another source, the man was General Fairfax, a leading parliamentarian. However, this is highly unlikely, given that Fairfax is believed to have been in opposition to the execution. Another source claims that it was Richard Brandon, who was the official executioner at the time, and he was well known to many people. And because of this, it is highly unlikely that he would have carried out the execution. The King's Head pub today occupies the site of a medieval house. This once belonged to Thomas Lynch Fitzambrose, who was the last of the old tribal mayors of Galway. This man lost his home and mayoral office to Peter Stubbers in 1654. While the present building has been reconstructed and restored, it opened as a pub in the 1970s. And there are very important sections on the premises dating from the late medieval times, and part of the original structure still exists there. So the pub today is a hugely important part of Galway's history, and a hugely important part of the whole Cromwellian period. This here, Chinocton's pub, was the former home of Sir Richard Martin. He was better known as Humanity Martin because of his kindness to animals, and he was the first man to have laws passed against cruelty to animals in 1821. He's also known as Trigger Martin because he was a duellist and quite an established one at the time. One of the tribal families that survived and had a significant impact in Galway were the Martins. Chinocton's pub on the corner of Quay Street and Cross Street was once the townhouse of Sir Richard Martin. Richard Martin was born at Dangan in 1754. He was educated at Harrow and Trinity College, Cambridge. On the 1st of February 1777, he married the very beautiful Elizabeth Versey, whose family were from County Mayo. They both had a big interest in theatricals, which led to Martin setting up a small theatre in the nearby Kerwins Lane. During the 1780s, Wolfe Tone joined the household as a tutor to Martin's two younger half-brothers, Robert and Anthony. One was 12 and the other 13. Tone fell in love with Elizabeth Martin and mentions her passionately in his diaries. It is not known did she return his affections, but he once wrote he had never stepped beyond the bounds of her virtue, which would indicate no. However, any relationship that they may have had ended after a disagreement with Martin on another issue. Tone later became a leading Irish nationalist and died following the failed rebellion of 1798. Martin and his wife left for Paris in 1789. While staying in Paris, Elizabeth had an affair that ended the marriage. A second marriage followed for Martin on the 5th of June 1796, when he married Harriet Evans. Martin became a member of Parliament for Galway and strongly supported Catholic emancipation. He held the rank of Colonel in the Galway Volunteers. The Lord Lieutenant of Ireland appointed him High Sheriff of County Galway, which was a much coveted honour. Martin was one of the most famous duellists of his period, being an expert with both pistol and sword. He is reputed to have fought over 100 duels in his lifetime, which earned him the nickname Hair Trigger Martin. His reputation with a duelling pistol diffused many difficult situations. On one occasion, an argument broke out during a dinner party at his home. Martin turned to his servant and called out in a loud voice, "Melt the lid, John!" And his remark had the desired effect and brought order to the situation. Sir Jonah Barrington described Martin as possessing courtesy towards women, benevolence towards men, and humanity towards brute creation. He was more commonly known as Humanity Martin. It was the Prince Regent, later George IV, who honoured him with this name, and this was because of his compassion towards animals. Martin fought tirelessly for legislation to be enacted against cruelty to animals. His determination paid off in 1822 when he initiated the first animal rights bill and pushed it through Parliament. It was known as Martin's Act, and this eventually led to the foundation of the Royal Society for the Protection of Cruelty to Animals. Martin was sometimes called the King of Connemara also, and this was because of the absolute power he wielded over the immense territory that he owned. Richard Martin died on the 6th of January 1834. Just prior to his death, a contemporary wrote a most fitting epitaph of him. In life, he was never equalled, and when he dies, by whom shall he be replaced? Now this is the Hall of the Red Earl. This is the de Burgo family. Richard de Burgo, who actually founded Galway in the early 13th century. It's a hugely important site and rediscovered in recent years by the 1990s. And a lot of artefacts, over 200 artefacts were found here on this particular site. It is part of the old medieval history of Galway, and it is another absolutely important piece of stonework that we have. Some people call it the banqueting hall, and others just refer to it as the Red Earl's Hall. The hall takes its name from Richard de Burgo, one of the most powerful Normans in Ireland. This was his castle, and he was known as the Red Earl, possibly because of the colour of his hair. His grandfather, who was also called Richard, had taken control of the area in 1235 and began building the town as we know today. The hall was constructed on a section of an older Irish fort and became a very important building within the old city walls. It has been described as the first municipal building in Galway. It was also used for tax collection and dispensing justice. The structure is sometimes referred to as the banqueting hall. It is believed that the hall was in use until the late 15th century, when the famous tribal families of Galway seized power from the De Burghers and forced them out of the city. The hall was subsequently abandoned and is depicted as a ruin on the 1651 pictorial map of Galway. The ruined hall was lost over the following centuries, when other buildings were erected on the site. However, the remains were uncovered by the Office of Public Works in 1997, when development work was planned to extend adjacent offices. Archaeologists were called in, and during the major excavations that were carried out on the site, hundreds of artefacts were uncovered, including a very important stone cannonball. The rediscovery of the structure led to the proposed extension plans being completely changed to allow for the preservation of the Red Earl's Hall. However, this did not create any real problems, as all concerned were well aware of the importance of the site. Glass panelling, floodlights and a gangway were all part of the plans to allow visitors to view the remains of the hall. There are also interpretive panels to explain the significance of the site, and a number of artefacts that were found there are on display. One of the panels depicts a conjectural illustration by Jack Harrison showing how the hall would have looked. The Hall of the Red Earl had the distinction of being listed as the top attraction in Galway City by Lonely Planet Guidebook. Tens of thousands of people have visited the remains of the structure since they were exposed, giving us all a glimpse of 13th century Norman Galway. This building that we're at now is Lynchs Castle. It was the home of one of the powerful tribal families of Galway. According to at least one source, Lynchs Castle at the end of Key Street was formerly owned by an ancient Irish chief named However, most sources give credit to the Blake family for actually building the castle. The Blake family were of Anglo-Norman origin and are noted among the tribes of Galway. They fortified the castle in 1641, which was a time of great danger in Ireland. It seems that they lost the property during the mid-17th century because of the Cromwellian land confiscations. The castle was then granted to the Morgan family of Monksfield. They were in possession of the castle when it was selected in October 1686 as a jail, after the sheriff complained about the lack of suitable places to secure prisoners. The castle was an imposing structure at the time, and it was possibly for this reason it was chosen. Renovations were carried out to accommodate the prisoners. However, accommodation was very basic and unhygienic, even during the 18th century. In 1788, the noted philanthropist John Howard visited the jail as part of his tour of Irish prisons and hospitals. He noted that the criminals were being housed in 2 long rooms with dirt floors, and there were no fireplaces, thus no heating. There was no water pump or exercise yard, all of which would indicate that it was a grim place for prisoners. The prisoners were given a household loaf of bread every few days. the annual salary of the warden was £20. The Morgan family were still recorded as owners of the castle in the 1790s, as they were being paid an annual rent of £40 for the use of the building. The castle continued to serve as a prison until the new jail opened in 1810 on the site now occupied by the new cathedral. Lynchs Castle was then used as a corner store, and this went on into the 19th century, and over the following years it fell into a ruined state. By the mid-20th century, all that remained of the original castle was the south wall facing the street and a small portion of the west and east walls. There was an ESB substation inserted into the front of the castle during this period, and one could see the remains of the old prison bars in the south wall, and this was a reminder to the people of its former use. There was a danger of the castle being demolished at one stage, but this was successfully resisted by the efforts of the Old Galway Society and the Galway Archaeological and Historical Society. The castle is now tastefully restored and used for commercial purposes. Now we're at the Spanish Arch in Galway. It's one of the iconic, we'll say, features of Galway. It's a lot of postcards and photographs taken of this. It was first constructed and built in between 1583 and 1584 as part of an extension to the city wall. Cannon were placed on it, protected, because this was the medieval quays that's here. So we'll just walk through the arch and we'll look at the beautiful carving on the far side of the city wall. The fortification of the town was completed in 1584 with the erection of Cian or the head of the wall, which later became known as the Spanish Arch. The structure was essentially an extension to the old city wall, but as a citadel it also protected the medieval port. The sea washed up against the outer wall of the citadel at that time. The 1651 pictorial map of Galway depicts cannon placed on top of the structure, which certainly indicates that it was a fortification. This was an extremely busy area of the medieval city. It must have been an exciting place to visit when the old galleys arrived, laden with imported wines, spices and other precious commodities, all en route to the merchant princes of the city. The ships were then reloaded with local produce for export before sailing away to distant European ports. The Spanish Arch, as it became known, has witnessed countless visitors and sailors of all nationalities from across Europe over the centuries. The decline of the merchant classes following the Cromwellian conquest in the 1650s ended this commercial trade in the city. The loss of the commerce also signalled an end to this important international port. Eventually, the medieval docks was filled in and formed what later would become known as the Spanish Parade, which is directly in front of the arch. This area was then used as a fish market for the women of the Claddagh, an old village across the river. The fortification also outlived its original purpose after the port became redundant, and by the 1750s an arch was opened in the structure, giving access to the Long Walk. Many people believe that the Spanish Arch derived its name because of the trade with Spain. However, there is another narrative that suggests that the arch derived its name because of a Spanish sailor who was supposedly found murdered under the arch during the 18th century. It is sometimes referred to as the Blind Arch, and this name refers to the archway closest to the sea, which has no exit. This section once housed a forge and it seems a shop, but it later fell out of use. Comerford House, which is attached to the arch, was occupied by the artist Claire Sheridan during the 1940s. She was a cousin of Sir Winston Churchill and Sir Shane Leslie, and one could access the roof through a winding staircase in the house. In 1972, Comerford House was acquired by Galway Corporation, now Galway City Council, and with the support from Bord Fáilte, the building was transformed into the new Galway City Museum. It was a labyrinth of artefacts from around the old city. This museum closed in 2006 to make way for the new state-of-the-art centre, Galway City Museum, located just behind the Spanish Arch. This is one of the oldest areas in the city. Over the years, the Spanish Arch has been the subject of photographs, postcards, colour illustrations, drawings and paintings, and remains a theme for artists even today. The Spanish Arch is an iconic landmark in Galway City and continues to attract visitors from all over the world. I would like to thank you all for accompanying me on this virtual tour of Galway. What you've seen over the past hour is really just a brief overview of the history of our beautiful city. The tour is based on my book, Galway, Walking Through History, and there are many more stories on these pages to be discovered. My details can be found at the end of the programme.